Hey, welcome back. This last part of the lecture, we're going to talk about methodology. Whereas in the lecture on theory, that's a set of explanations for why things exist the way they do. Methodology is, well, how do we collect that information? Remember, theory is based on grounded experience, grounded observation. How do we collect that data? How do we collect that information? Methodology then is a way of showing how sociologists collect data. So first off, sociological investigation requires two key requirements. When we are out in the field, when we're trying to understand different social realities, what are two things that sociologists need? The first thing that they need is a sociological perspective. They're not coming at it from a psychological perspective or an individual personal point of view. They're looking at the social environment from a sociological point of view. That's really important. The second thing that it requires is just to be curious and ask questions. Really, as a sociologist, we want to be open to whatever is happening in front of us, not to prejudge or have assumptions about what's happening, but really just to be open to what is happening in and around us. There are a few sort of methodologies that I'm going to introduce to you today. The first is known as scientific sociology. Scientific sociology is a method where you're very systematic. You systematically study society, and you want to be able to replicate what you find. So if someone looks at your research, they could go out and find the exact same thing. Typically, scientific sociology is quantitative, meaning that it's dealing with numbers. Usually you're doing a study that involves 1,000, 10,000 people. It's a more sort of statistical based research. In terms of methodology, there's a couple of different ways that you can do scientific sociology. The first is sort of an experiment where you look at cause and effect within a highly controlled condition, trying to understand how and why certain behavior occurs. So studies like looking at how people handle stress, how people handle certain social roles, you can do that in a sort of contained sort of way. There was a study that was done on how people handle pain, and this was sort of right after the Holocaust. So people were trying to understand how could people inflict pain upon another human being and not even think twice about it. Was it something about the Germans that made them more apt to act that way, or is it like a condition of all human beings? So they did this it was out of Stanford University, and they had one person was going to be inflicting the pain, and the other person was going to receive it. They did a shock, basically. They had an electrical shock that was generated. Well, the people that were receiving the shock, they were actually part of the experiment. So they actually didn't really get the shock, essentially. And then the person that was giving it, they were the ones that didn't know what was going on. And so they had sort of this range, of shocks that they could give, steadily increasing over time. And at first, when they did this study, almost all the participants went all the way, and the level of shock that was sort of all the way was like they were basically like killing the person. And so they had to do the experiment a couple of different times just to get more accurate portrayal, because why would someone do that? So they changed it so that the person receiving the shock, you could hear them scream. And would that change the human behavior? And that didn't change it. People still continued to do it. And the reason why they asked them, well, why would you do that? They said, well, we thought it was for the greater good. You were trying to understand human behavior, so I wanted to go along with it. So here you have a highly controlled experiment trying to understand human behavior, and in this one, it's quite disturbing, and they really couldn't get anyone not to do it. Given a certain kind of environment, people are willing to go the distance. Okay, so another kind of scientific sociology method that you could do is a survey. This one's much more prevalent is what usually you'll see is surveys. People basically give out surveys to people within a certain population, questionnaires or interviews, and they respond to a series of statements or questions, and then they'll be able to collect all that data and make sort of statistical sense of what's happening. The second type of methodology is known as interpretive sociology, and this is typically qualitative research. You actually take part in the social world in which you study. You are observing human behavior, you're involved. A lot of times it's not just that you are looking, at what's happening, but you're actually interacting. You're actually a part of the social scene with interpretive sociology. So the methodology that's most used here is what's called participant observation. You're a participant, you're participating, and you're also observing what people are doing. It's definitely descriptive and explanatory. You're describing what's going on, and you're trying to make sense of it and explaining it as well. The last kind of methodology is known as critical sociology. Critical sociology is moving beyond just studying the world and towards changing it. So typically, critical sociology results in some form of activism. People are going to use the research that they generated to actually, inform policy or maybe some kind of social movement. So critical sociology is not just about collecting data, but it's also about changing the social world in which you're part of. So methodology here is known as action research. It's research from the ground up, and it's usually policy-based research. Any research that can create change in a community or on a policy level is what we're looking at here. And it can be a combination of both quantitative and qualitative research, meaning that you can use statistical information as well as in-depth interviews as a way of making change. So for example, if people wanted to improve violence in the home, that they might want to create policy or inform a policy, they could do statistical research on the issue and also perhaps interview people who are involved in violence in the home and then introduce it to the Senate or something like that as a way of changing society, hopefully for the better. So those are the three types of methods that I want you to know. So the first one is scientific sociology, second interpretive sociology, and then the last critical sociology. As a way of closing the lecture, I'd like you to do this lecture-based assignment 2B, which is to formulate a research plan for studying student excuses. So you come up with a list of why people do the things that they do, and you kind of categorize them in terms of the theory of why you think it's happening. But what if you were actually to go out and do research on this issue? Why do students make excuses? So I've given you the steps in conducting research, and also I'll go ahead and give them to you now. The first is problem formulation. Who are you studying? Why are you studying it? You want to be really specific here. So maybe you want to do a study on community colleges or high school students. Maybe you want to do a comparison between university students versus community college students. Here's where you're going to put that in the problem formulation. The second thing is develop a research design. Well, how are you going to collect the data? What ways are you going to do it? And you might want to look at the methodology that we just went over. Observation, survey, and experiment. This is what you're going to articulate here as a research design. And then how are you going to collect it? Are you going to come on campus? Are you going to sit in classes? What sort of the data collection approach that you're going to take? And then how are you going to analyze it? Once you've collected the data, what sort of analytical point of view are you going to take? Are you going to use a functional point of view, a conflict point of view, an interactionist? What sort of theory I would say is what are you going to use to explain your data? And then what kind of conclusions do you think you'll be able to make from the research that you're going to do? And then finally, what are you going to do with what you found? Are you going to publish it in a journal? Are you going to maybe contact a news station and tell them about the study that you're doing? How are you going to disseminate your findings? So go ahead and do that as lecture-based assignment 2B. And I look forward to talking with you again soon.